Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, February 20th, 2021, and today I want to talk about how the Democratic Party came to the closest Senate majority since 2001. That was the last time we had a 50-50 United States Senate delegation where the vice president had to break the tie and ultimately determined the majority. Now, this has only happened 4 times in United States history. The majorities have always been close at some point, but never really 50-50. Only recently has this grown to a position where the Democratic Party could actually consider getting things done because they consider removing the filibuster. But previously, 50-50 meant it was a death sentence for both parties, including the majority party. Looking at what was happening in the United States Senate, they were forced to work together, and things weren't as, I would say, drastically different. You see, the parties have pretty much moved away from voting with one another, which is why every single seat matters in this 50-50 Senate. You see, what happened in previous elections was there were conservative Democrats that crossed over. And there are a few now, but not that many compared to the amount previously. You look at Joe Manchin, he's one of the last standing conservative Democrats. I wouldn't consider Jon Tester really a conservative Democrat. In fact, Kyrsten Sinema is probably the most conservative, technically, out of all of them, including Joe Manchin. But Joe Manchin is the only one that comes from a very deep red state. Some could argue Montana's the same way, but West Virginia voted for Trump by double the margin. And looking at his policies, sure, he votes for the Democratic Party roughly 50% of the time, more than he's supposed to based off his constituents. But, he's probably the last standing, I would say, conservative Democrat that has to rely on a very solid Republican base to win his election. Kyrsten Sinema doesn't have to do it. Jon Tester comes from a state that is known for ticket splitting. So Joe Manchin might be the only one. But looking at this 50-50 Senate, you have to realize, how did the Democrats come to a point where now the entire Senate is bent on a senator from West Virginia? And that's what we're going to be going through. We're going to be talking about how the Democrats ended up with the narrowest Senate majority that they've seen in 20 years and why that happened. So this actually goes back to 2 Senate cycles before. The 2016 United States Senate election cycle. The Democratic Party got 48 seats. The Republicans got 52. The Democrats were able to pick up 2 Senate seats, but it wasn't enough to win control of the United States Senate. They needed an additional 3 seats to win control. Where did the Democrats contest? Well, they contested Wisconsin and lost. They contested Pennsylvania and lost. They contested North Carolina and lost. You see, these 3 races in particular, they were supposed to be races that the Democratic Party could have picked up. But it wasn't just there. They had opportunities that they no longer have in 2022. They had a competitive race in Indiana, a 10-point margin of victory for the GOP when Trump won by 19 percentage points. That's a lot of crossover support. In Missouri, Donald Trump won the state by 19 percentage points. Roy Blunt, the incumbent Republican, won by under 3 percentage points. Had this been a 15-point margin of victory for Trump, we would still have a United States Senator from the Democratic Party from Missouri. And it wouldn't have been Claire McCaskill, it would have been Jason Kander. So looking at Missouri, looking at Indiana, we had surprisingly close races in these states. But a bunch of the other ones were ultimately the same. Going across the South, including Georgia, which now is held by a Democrat, the Republican won there by 14 percentage points. But looking around, there weren't really too many competitive races. Outside of the ones that we're typically used to, even Arizona went to John McCain by roughly 13 percentage points. But looking at the state of Missouri and the state of Indiana, these are 2 races that are no longer going to be competitive for the Democratic Party. Unless they have a candidate that can win, it probably won't be as competitive as it was previously. And also, many people expected the Democratic Party to win back control of the Senate, but it wasn't as sure as it was in 2020. They did it in 2020, they didn't do it in 2018, and they certainly didn't do it in 2016, but they were projected to in 2016. And the margin in Indiana was supposed to be not so close. It's closer than it actually was. The chances of winning in Indiana and Missouri were less for the Republican than they were for the Democratic Party. In Wisconsin, where they ended up losing, Russ Feingold actually held this seat, had an 82% chance of victory, but nobody expected Trump to win the election. So that's what carried Ron Johnson over the top, but he did better than Trump, significantly better. In Pennsylvania, Katie McGinty, which was arguably a very winnable race, Pat Toomey ended up carrying it. Reminds me of Joe Sestak in this particular seat because Democrats seem to drop the ball in Pennsylvania. We'll see what happens in 2022. At least in this particular Senate seat. They've had a weird history here under Obama and now under Donald Trump, but we'll see what happens. Looking at North Carolina, Deborah Ross was still considered to be a candidate who could possibly win. 1 in 4 chance is still pretty strong. In Nevada, it was supposed to be very, very close. But looking at, I would say, let's take Indiana, for example. Evan Bayh was expected to win by a very large amount. He had an 87% chance of victory at some point, August, leading up to the election. I mean, August, right? That's convention time period. That's leading up to the election. And it wasn't until the final stretch, literally the final few days, 7 days before, 1 week before the election, Evan Bayh, the Democrat, was expected to win. It ended up flipping significantly. And, looking at Evan Bayh's drastic jump, I mean, this happened because we saw more data that was released, consecutive poll after poll after poll, that showed Evan Bayh ahead with double-digit leads because he was a recognizable name. But as we got closer and as Trump started making the state more and more Republican, also had, Donald Trump won Indiana by Mitt Romney's margin as 2012, Democrats would have won the Senate seat. Looking at the results, they were expected to be much closer, but looking at the chances, they still expected the GOP to win. So the Democrats were really relying on Wisconsin and Pennsylvania to carry them over into 2018 because 2018 was undoubtedly going to be a bloodbath. It didn't actually happen in 2018, but looking at what was expected to happen with a Hillary Clinton presidency, they needed every single seat. They lost Wisconsin, they lost Pennsylvania, they lost Indiana, they lost Missouri, and they lost North Carolina. Florida wasn't really contested, but it still had a lot of funding headed into that race. But they lost these key 5 states. And that's what was the spiraling down pathward for the Democratic Party. Because 2016, they had an ample opportunity to win back Senate control. I really do think that they did. Missouri was within 3 percentage points. Wisconsin was a larger margin of victory for the Republican than Missouri. Wisconsin was larger for the GOP than Missouri, right? So looking at those margins, Pat Toomey won by just 1.5%. These races are going to be competitive in 22. This is the same Senate map that you're going to be seeing. But looking at Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Indiana, North Carolina, completely winnable races. North Carolina probably the least out of all of them. Indiana, then North Carolina. But looking at them, they still had some point, had the Democratic Party in the favorite to win. But they ended up losing. So let's jump ahead to 2018, which was an arguably Democratic wave year. The Democrats won the popular vote in the Senate by 20 percentage points, but lost 2 seats. The Democrats were able to pick up seats in Nevada and Arizona, making those states have at least 1 Democratic senator or 2 Democratic senators. But the Republican Party coalition was able to flip back states that had a solid GOP history, specifically a solid Donald Trump history. North Dakota went back to the Republicans. It was only a 10-point victory. Trump won here by 30 percentage points. Missouri, Josh Hawley won over Claire McCaskill, very infamous name now, I would say, amongst the Democratic Party. A 5-point margin of victory against Claire McCaskill, a 19-point margin of victory for Donald Trump in 2016. So just 2 years prior, a drastic difference. Missouri, surprisingly close races, but ultimately the GOP comes ahead. Indiana, Mike Braun defeated the incumbent Joe Donnelly by just 6 percentage points. That's not a blowout. That is not a blowout in a state Trump won by 19. Had Donald Trump not been in the political fray, I honestly do think the Democratic Party would have won Indiana in 2016, not in the presidential election, the Senate election, and in 2018, depending on who the incumbent was. But if it was Marco Rubio, if it was Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, absolutely. Florida, though. Florida was the real shocker. And this is where the Democratic Party ultimately messed up. And, it could be due to the fact that Bill Nelson did not send out campaign ads in Spanish. It could be due to the fact that Rick Scott was a popular governor. I think it was a perfect storm for the GOP, and it was one of the narrowest victories that we saw this entire campaign cycle. I mean, looking at the margin, out of 8 million votes, a difference of 11,000 determined this Senate seat for 6 years. Bill Nelson, the incumbent, he should have done well. He did better than Biden, significantly better than Biden. In fact, looking at this victory here, I would say Bill Nelson probably would have been stronger than Biden in Florida, even though probably would have ended up losing to Trump, probably would have been stronger. But looking at this very, 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 very minuscule margin, honestly, the Democratic Party probably should have paid someone to run as a libertarian. But looking at the results, I'm surprised to see a little bit that Bill Nelson ended up losing. I was surprised to see it back in 2018. He was expected to win, widely expected to win. But Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota weren't shockers. And I think the Democratic Party did well with damage control, but they could have won back the Senate. Had they retained Indiana, had they retained Missouri, these were races that were winnable within single digits. And had they retained Florida, it would have put them at 50. Maybe not enough to win, but you also have to realize that the Democratic Party was competitive in other Senate races. You see, looking at Tennessee, this one was decided by 11 percentage points. I know that doesn't seem like it's competitive, but it was for a very long part of the 2018 election season. Texas was decided by 2.6%. Texas, Ted Cruz's seat, was decided by 2.6%. Democrats won Arizona by a similar margin. Texas was extremely narrow, and honestly, I think the Democratic Party is really upset now that they lost that state. I mean, they were very upset back then, but they weren't expecting to win it. But now I bet they really wish that they would have. But Utah, Wyoming, Nebraska didn't end up really being competitive. That weren't going to be competitive from the beginning. And Democrats were able to lock down Pennsylvania, lock down Michigan, lock down Wisconsin, lock down even West Virginia, lock down Montana, still win these races. They were single digits, but the Democrats were able to do enough control that they were able to win the races that they wouldn't have been had Donald Trump, been on the same ballot. But looking at North Dakota, Missouri, and Indiana, these were races that I would argue Florida absolutely was winnable. You can't even question that. That was a drop the ball type moment for the Democratic Party. But Missouri, Indiana, North Dakota, looking at the 2018 forecast, they weren't expected to win all of them, but they were expected to win Indiana. They were expected to narrowly win Missouri, even though I think that was just a miscalculation. If you look at the deluxe here, it actually pushed Josh Hawley up. Looking at Indiana, it narrowed up the chances. North Dakota went solid, pretty solid, likely are for the GOP. But looking at the results, North Dakota seemed to be out of reach, but Missouri and Indiana, let's say the Democratic Party was able to funnel more money into those races, they might have been winnable. And, Tennessee seemed to be close, didn't end up being close. That close, competitive for Tennessee. Competitive for Tennessee, I'll just put it that way. But 2018, the Democratic Party lost 2 seats, which ultimately doomed them, at least originally, for the 2020 Senate map. And that's what we're getting into now. So after a lackluster performance in both 2016 and an arguably okay performance, I would say, in 2018, good where they won, but bad where they lost, obviously. That's just standard for every election, but Florida definitely was the one that they could have prevented, because had they won Florida, they would be at 51-49 right now. It would not have mattered, and 1 Senate seat in Georgia would have been enough to put them over the top. But looking now at the 2020 map, what happened? What happened here? The Democratic Party only won the competitive races in Georgia and Arizona. Other than that, they lost. If you remember, if you followed my channel closely, we all knew there were competitive Senate races. Montana was competitive. Iowa was competitive. Kansas was competitive. North Carolina was competitive. Maine was competitive. South Carolina was competitive. Looking at these 6 races, some people thought Texas. I didn't think so. I thought it would be likely, and it was, but it wasn't really competitive. But looking at these races, Alaska, competitive. The margins here for the GOP were not nearly as strong as Donald Trump's, but they still won, largely because of Donald Trump. South Carolina, the most money raised for a Senate Democratic candidate before Georgia's runoff, lost to the GOP. Kansas, Barbara Bollier raised a lot of money, lost. Sarah Gideon, up in Maine, raised a lot of money. Susan Collins expected widely to lose, lost. Iowa, Teresa Greenfield, had a closer race than some, but still ended up losing. Steve Bullock, the popular governor from Montana, the incumbent at the time, lost to a Republican incumbent. And it's not as if people were expecting these races to go blue, but some people were expecting a surprise seat. Could Montana have that 30% chance? Would you take a 30% chance of winning the Senate? I know I would. That wasn't bad for Steve Bullock. It just ended up that the higher chance ended up coming true. Same thing in Iowa. Joni Ernst. And these margins were expected to be much closer because, as many of us did, we underestimated President Trump's amount of support. South Carolina was expected to be close. It was closer than it had been in years past, but Lindsey Graham ultimately won it. Nobody was really expecting Democrats to win in Kansas or Democrats to win in South Carolina, but Maine is where they really messed up. Sarah Gideon had a 59% chance of victory, and Susan Collins had a strong chance of victory, 41%, but she won by 8 percentage points. Partially due to ranked choice voting, because Susan Collins didn't go under 50. We didn't see a lot of that Lisa Savage support crossover, but this is still an 8-point margin of victory. This was obliterating Sarah Gideon, practically, relative to other Senate candidates. That's comparable to the Republican Party's victory in Montana. Better than the Republican Party's victory in North Carolina. Better than the Republican Party's victory in Iowa, coming from Maine, of all places. And I get it. Susan Collins was someone who had won her re-election bid last time by 30 percentage points. But Democrats still thought that they had a very significant chance of winning here. Every poll indicated it. This is the only race where we never saw a singular poll showing the opposition party candidate winning. We had never seen that in any other race. But looking at Maine, I would say that's where the Democratic Party really messed up. Because I don't know what went wrong. That was something that they would have to identify within the Maine Democratic Party, but something went wrong up in the northeastern section. Because Susan Collins' vote 94% of the time with Trump, something that they attacked her for, but it was very clear that those main constituents cared about certain issues, and the Democratic Party might not have covered it. But looking at Maine, looking at North Carolina, looking at Iowa, looking at Montana, looking at Kansas, these are races, South Carolina, these are races that were initially rated as safe for the GOP, that got more competitive, but at the end of the day, the result was the same, and the same senator was elected to a 6-year term. Hundreds of millions of dollars, $300 million across all the races that I mentioned. $300 million, at least. For the Democrats, combined with the Republicans even, that would be probably $500 million, $500 million in these competitive Senate races. All to have the same result as predicted by the pundits 2 years out. So yes, the Democrats were able to make 2020 a better map for them. I think so. But it wasn't enough to win them, which is why they have the narrowest majority since 2001. They got bailed out by Georgia. They got bailed out by black voters, plainly put. And looking at the Senate map now, they're in a very narrow majority, but they still have the majority, and they should be thankful for that. This is the only election where they were widely expected to win the majority, and it would have been very unfortunate for them if they lost it. But 50-50 is nothing to brag about, but it's certainly something that the Democratic Party did not have in years past. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.